Welcome to Night Crime Stories. Tonight, we examine the case of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist, the greatest art theft in history. 13 priceless masterpieces vanished into the Boston night, worth $500 million. 30 years later, empty frames still hang on the walls, and the mystery deepens. Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the case unfold. Maintain 80 to 90 words per minute maximum. Use pauses liberally to create atmosphere. Emphasize investigative uncertainty and mounting questions. Build tension through pacing rather than dramatic inflection. Professional journalist tone throughout. Tonight, we explore a case that began with what seemed like an extraordinary tale of survival against impossible odds. A man claiming to have been kidnapped by cartels and forced to compete in a deadly sporting tournament. An Olympic athlete turned unwilling gladiator in the criminal underworld of Mexico. But as one journalist would discover, the truth has a way of revealing itself in layers, each one more complex and troubling than the last. What started as verification of a sensational story became something far more intricate, a web involving fraud, false identities, international organizations, and celebrities whose names you would recognize. Sometimes the most fascinating crimes are not the ones that make headlines, but the ones that exist in the shadows between truth and fiction, between what we want to believe and what actually happened. Tonight, we follow that shadow. We trace the investigation that revealed not just one deception, but an entire architecture of lies built over years, perhaps decades. This is the story of how a journalist went looking for a cartel kidnapping and found something far more disturbing. A story about the nature of truth itself, and how easily it can be manipulated by those who understand the power of a compelling narrative. December 2024. McKay Coppins, a staff writer at The Atlantic, receives an unusual request. A filmmaker approaches him with what they describe as a massive story, one with all the elements of a Hollywood thriller, but allegedly rooted in terrifying reality. The story centers on a man named Mauricio Morales, though those close to him call him Mao. The tale Mao tells is extraordinary in its scope and horrifying in its implications. According to his account, he was kidnapped by a cartel somewhere in Mexico. But this wasn't a typical kidnapping for ransom or territorial dispute. Instead, Mao claims that once his captors discovered his background as a former Olympian, they saw an opportunity for something far more sinister. Mao alleged that he was forced to compete in what he described as an intercartel sporting tournament, a secret competition where athletes competed not for medals or glory, but for their very lives. The stakes, according to his story, were absolute. Win, and you might live to see another day. Lose, and the consequences were fatal. For Coppins, a journalist with years of experience investigating complex stories, the initial reaction was skepticism. The story had elements that seemed almost too cinematic, too perfectly constructed for maximum dramatic impact. In an era where misinformation and elaborate hoaxes have become increasingly sophisticated, any responsible journalist would approach such claims with considerable caution. But there was something about Mao's manner when they spoke that gave Coppins pause. The way he told his story, the details he provided, the emotional weight he seemed to carry, these didn't immediately strike the journalist as the hallmarks of fabrication. Mao appeared genuinely traumatized, genuinely fearful of retribution from the criminal organizations he claimed had held him captive. The Olympic background was verifiable, at least in part. Records showed that Mauricio Morales had indeed competed at an Olympic level, though the specifics of his athletic career would require deeper investigation. This detail lent some credibility to his account, providing at least one concrete fact that could be independently confirmed. Still, the core of Mao's story, the intercartel tournament, the life-or-death competition, remained extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence. Coppins knew that proceeding with such an investigation would require extensive resources, careful planning, and most importantly, a methodical approach to separating fact from fiction. The journalist's initial conversations with Mao extended over several sessions. Each time they spoke, new details emerged. Mao described the location where he was allegedly held, the other competitors he claimed to have encountered, the structure of the tournament itself. He painted a picture of a criminal underworld that operated with almost military precision, organizing elaborate competitions for the entertainment of cartel leadership. According to Mao's account, these tournaments weren't random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated events. Athletes from various backgrounds, some kidnapped, others coerced through threats to their families, were brought together to compete in their respective sports under conditions of extreme duress. The psychological pressure alone, Mao claimed, was enough to break many competitors before they even began. The tournaments, as Mao described them, served multiple purposes within the cartel ecosystem. They provided entertainment for high-ranking criminal figures, settled disputes between different organizations, and demonstrated power through the control of human life itself. It was, according to his story, a manifestation of absolute power, the ability to force individuals to perform at their highest level while facing imminent death. Coppens found himself drawn into the investigation despite his initial reservations. The story, if true, would represent one of the most horrific examples of human trafficking and forced participation in criminal activities ever documented. It would expose a level of organizational sophistication within Mexican cartels that exceeded even the most pessimistic intelligence assessments. But verification would be challenging, to say the least. Cartels operate in secrecy, leaving little documentation of their activities. Witnesses are often unreliable, either through trauma, fear of retribution, or deliberate misinformation. Physical evidence is typically destroyed or hidden. And victims, even if they escape, may be reluctant to speak with authorities or journalists due to ongoing safety concerns. Nevertheless, Coppens made the decision to pursue the investigation. The potential significance of the story, combined with his professional obligation to seek truth, outweighed the considerable challenges involved. He began planning what would become a months-long investigation, one that would take him from initial interviews in the United States to extensive field work in Mexico. The first phase involved extensive background checks on Mao himself. Coppens needed to verify not just the Olympic claims, but every aspect of Mauricio Morales' identity and history that could be independently confirmed. This meant diving deep into athletic records, immigration documents, educational backgrounds, and any other paper trail that might support or contradict Mao's version of events. Initial research revealed some interesting details about Mao's background, though not all of them aligned perfectly with his self-presentation. There were gaps in his timeline, inconsistencies in some of his biographical details, and questions about certain claims regarding his athletic achievements. However, these discrepancies weren't necessarily damning. Trauma survivors often have fragmented memories, and administrative records can be incomplete or inaccurate. As Coppens delved deeper into the preliminary investigation, he began to develop a methodology for approaching the central claims. He would need to speak with Mao's family members, friends, and associates to corroborate his general background and character. He would need to research the specific locations where the alleged kidnapping and tournament took place, examining everything from local crime patterns to geographical details that might support or undermine the story. Most challenging of all, he would need to find ways to investigate claims about cartel activities without putting himself or his sources at unacceptable risk. This would require working with local fixers, security professionals, and individuals with deep knowledge of criminal organizations in Mexico, all while maintaining the independence and objectivity essential to good journalism. As winter gave way to spring, McKay Coppens found himself increasingly immersed in the world that Mauricio Morales had described. The investigation had evolved from a simple fact-checking assignment into something far more complex and time-consuming. Each conversation with Mao revealed new layers to his story, additional details that would need to be verified, and fresh claims that pushed the boundaries of believability. Mao's demeanor during these extended interviews was consistent with someone who had experienced significant trauma. He displayed what trauma experts describe as hypervigilance, constantly scanning his environment, startling at unexpected sounds, and showing visible signs of stress when discussing specific aspects of his alleged captivity. These behavioral patterns weren't proof of his claims, but they were consistent with someone who had endured extreme psychological pressure. The details of his story had a specificity that was both compelling and troubling. Mao could describe the layout of the facility where he was allegedly held, the appearance and mannerisms of his captors, the other athletes he claimed to have encountered, and even mundane details like the food he was given and the schedule of daily activities. This level of detail suggested either genuine experience or an extraordinarily elaborate fabrication. One aspect of Mao's account that particularly intrigued Coppens was his description of the other athletes in the tournament. According to his story, the competitors came from various Olympic disciplines: track and field, swimming, gymnastics, combat sports, and team sports like football and basketball. Each had their own story of how they came to be there, though Mao claimed he learned these details only through whispered conversations during rare moments when they weren't under direct supervision. Some of these other athletes, according to Mao, had been targeted specifically because of their Olympic credentials. Cartels, he claimed, had developed a sophisticated understanding of which sports and which level of achievement would provide the most impressive spectacle for their underground tournaments. This suggested a level of planning and research that went far beyond typical criminal kidnapping operations. Other competitors, Mao alleged, were chosen for different reasons. Some were individuals who had crossed the cartels in business dealings and were being given a chance to literally fight for their lives. Others were family members of people who owed debts to the organizations, forced to compete as a form of leverage against their relatives. The tournament, as Mao described it, served multiple functions within the criminal ecosystem. The structure of the competitions themselves, according to Mao's account, was sophisticated and professional. The cartels had apparently invested significant resources in creating facilities that could accommodate various Olympic sports at a high level. This wasn't, as one might imagine, a crude fighting ring or makeshift arena. Instead, Mao described a complex that included regulation-sized swimming pools, track and field facilities, gymnasiums equipped with professional-grade equipment, and even technology for broadcasting or recording the events. Perhaps most disturbing was Mao's description of the audience for these tournaments. According to his story, high-ranking members of multiple cartels would attend these events, sometimes bringing guests from other criminal organizations or even corrupt government officials. The tournaments served as both entertainment and diplomatic functions, providing neutral ground where different criminal factions could interact without the usual territorial tensions. Coppens spent considerable time trying to verify these structural claims through open-source intelligence and contacts with experts on Mexican organized crime. The journalist reached out to academic researchers who studied cartel operations, former law enforcement officials who had worked on cases involving organized crime in Mexico, and journalists with extensive experience covering criminal organizations in the region. The responses from these experts were mixed and troubling in their own right. While none had heard specific reports of intercartel sporting tournaments, several noted that cartels had demonstrated increasing sophistication in their operations over the past decade. They had evolved from simple drug trafficking organizations into complex criminal enterprises with diverse revenue streams and increasingly elaborate internal structures. Some experts pointed to documented cases where cartels had invested in seemingly legitimate businesses and facilities that could serve dual purposes. There had been reports of training facilities, entertainment venues, and even small airports built by criminal organizations that appeared to serve purposes beyond immediate drug trafficking operations. The idea that such organizations might organize complex sporting events wasn't entirely outside the realm of possibility. However, other experts expressed skepticism about the scale and coordination that Mao's story implied. Organizing multi-sport tournaments with high-level athletes would require significant logistical capabilities, substantial financial resources, and a level of intercartel cooperation that didn't align with most intelligence assessments of how these organizations typically operated. The competitive nature of the drug trade usually meant that cartels viewed each other as enemies, not collaborators in elaborate entertainment ventures. Coppens also began researching disappearances of Olympic athletes or high-level competitors in Mexico and other regions where cartels operated. This proved to be a challenging area of research, as athletic organizations don't typically maintain comprehensive databases of missing or deceased former competitors. However, the journalist was able to identify several cases of athletes who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in regions known for cartel activity. These cases didn't provide direct corroboration of Mao's specific claims, but they established that athletes had indeed been targeted by criminal organizations in the past. Some of these disappearances remained unsolved, while others had eventually been linked to kidnapping rings or human trafficking operations. The pattern suggested that criminals did sometimes target individuals with athletic backgrounds, though the reasons weren't always clear. As the investigation progressed, Coppens began to notice certain inconsistencies in Mao's story. Details would change slightly between tellings, dates would shift, and some claims would be modified or expanded without clear explanation. Again, these discrepancies weren't necessarily damning. Trauma can affect memory in complex ways, and it's common for survivors of extreme experiences to remember details differently over time. However, the pattern of inconsistencies was becoming difficult to ignore. When pressed for clarification on specific points, Mao would sometimes become defensive or evasive. He claimed that some details were too traumatic to discuss in depth, while others were supposedly too dangerous to reveal because they might allow the cartels to identify him or track his current location. Mao's fear of retribution appeared genuine and was consistent throughout all their conversations. He claimed that he had been released from the tournament not because he had won or escaped, but because of circumstances he was reluctant to explain in detail. According to his story, he had been given warnings that speaking about his experiences would result in severe consequences for himself and his family members still living in Mexico. This fear of retribution would become a central challenge for the investigation. If Mao's story was true, then pursuing verification could indeed put both the journalist and his sources at significant risk. Cartel violence against journalists is well documented, and Mexico consistently ranks as one of the most dangerous countries in the world for media professionals. The ethical implications of potentially exposing sources to violence while pursuing a story were substantial and would require careful consideration as the investigation moved forward. By early summer, McKay Coppens had reached a crucial decision point in his investigation. The preliminary research had raised more questions than it had answered, and it had become clear that meaningful progress would require field work in Mexico itself. This wasn't a decision to be taken lightly. Mexico had earned its reputation as one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists, with dozens of media professionals killed or disappeared each year, many while investigating stories related to organized crime. The logistics of such a trip were complex and would require careful planning with security professionals and local experts. Coppens couldn't simply fly to Mexico City and begin asking questions about cartel activities. Such an approach would be reckless and potentially suicidal. Instead, he would need to work with experienced fixers who understood the local landscape and could help navigate the complex web of relationships, territories, and unwritten rules that governed certain areas of Mexican society. Mao had been initially reluctant to participate in an on-site investigation, claiming that returning to Mexico would put him at unacceptable risk. However, after extensive discussions about security protocols and the importance of verifying his story, he eventually agreed to participate under specific conditions. He insisted on controlling the timing and locations of meetings, selecting which family members and associates the journalist would be permitted to interview, and maintaining veto power over any investigation activities he deemed too dangerous. The journalist's first priority was identifying and vetting local fixers who could provide both logistical support and security guidance. Through contacts at other news organizations and academic institutions, Coppens was able to identify several individuals with experience working with foreign journalists on sensitive stories in Mexico. The vetting process was extensive, involving background checks, reference conversations with other journalists who had worked with these fixers, and detailed discussions about security protocols and risk assessment. Eventually, Coppens selected a fixer with extensive experience in Mexico City and connections throughout the region. This individual, whose identity would need to remain protected throughout the investigation, had worked with multiple international news organizations on stories involving organized crime, government corruption, and human rights abuses. They possessed the local knowledge and professional relationships necessary to navigate the complex environment that Coppens would be entering. The security planning for the trip was extensive and sobering. Coppens worked with security consultants who specialized in high-risk journalism assignments to develop protocols for communication, movement, and emergency response. These protocols included regular check-ins with editors back in the United States, predetermined signals for various types of trouble, and contingency plans for different emergency scenarios. One particular challenge was determining which areas of Mexico City and the surrounding region would be safe for investigation activities. Mao claimed that his kidnapping had occurred in a specific neighborhood that was known to be under the control of one of the major cartels. Visiting this area would require special precautions and potentially armed security personnel, adding both cost and complexity to the investigation. The journalist also needed to consider the legal and ethical implications of his investigation. Mexican law enforcement has complex relationships with organized crime, and some areas of the country are effectively under the control of criminal organizations rather than government authorities. Investigating criminal activities in such areas could potentially put local sources at risk, violate Mexican laws, or inadvertently interfere with ongoing law enforcement operations. Coppens spent considerable time consulting with legal experts and editors to establish clear guidelines for the investigation. They developed protocols for handling sensitive information, protecting source identities, and ensuring that the investigation didn't inadvertently compromise ongoing law enforcement efforts or put innocent people at risk. These guidelines would prove crucial as the investigation progressed and uncovered increasingly complex layers of deception and criminal activity. The preparation phase also involved extensive research into the specific locations that Mao had described in his story. Using satellite imagery, street-level photography, and local knowledge provided by the fixer, Coppens began to map out the geography of Mao's alleged experiences. This research revealed some interesting discrepancies between Mao's descriptions and the actual physical characteristics of certain locations, though these differences weren't necessarily proof of fabrication. Memory can be unreliable, especially under conditions of extreme stress and trauma. It's well documented that kidnapping victims often have fragmented or inaccurate recollections of locations where they were held, particularly if they were transported while blindfolded or unconscious. However, the pattern of geographical inconsistencies in Mao's story was beginning to raise questions that would need to be addressed during the field investigation. Another crucial aspect of the preparation involved researching Mao's family and social connections in Mexico. If his story was accurate, these individuals would likely have noticed his disappearance and possibly reported it to authorities or undertaken their own search efforts. Conversely, if the story was fabricated, family members might provide information that contradicted his account or revealed alternative explanations for any periods of absence from his normal routines. The journalist's research into Mao's background in Mexico revealed a complex network of relationships and activities that didn't entirely align with the narrative he had presented. There were business connections that hadn't been mentioned in their conversations, periods of residence in different locations than he had described, and social relationships that raised questions about certain aspects of his story. None of these discoveries were definitively contradictory, but they suggested that Mao's background was more complicated than he had initially indicated. Coppens also began researching the broader context of Olympic athlete experiences in Mexico, looking for patterns that might support or contradict Mao's claims about being targeted because of his athletic background. This research revealed that former Olympic athletes in Mexico often faced significant economic challenges after their competitive careers ended, sometimes leading them to pursue business opportunities or social connections that could potentially bring them into contact with criminal organizations. The economic pressures faced by former Olympic athletes were particularly acute in developing countries where government support for retired athletes was limited and commercial endorsement opportunities were scarce. Some athletes have been documented as becoming involved in business ventures that operated in legal gray areas or had connections to criminal organizations, though this was typically through economic necessity rather than deliberate criminal intent. As the departure date for Mexico approached, Coppens found himself grappling with increasing doubts about certain aspects of Mao's story. The inconsistencies and unexplained elements were accumulating, and the preliminary research had failed to provide the corroborating evidence that might be expected for such extraordinary claims. However, the journalist recognized that field investigation would be necessary to reach any definitive conclusions about the truth or falsehood of Mao's allegations. The final preparation phase involved detailed coordination with Mao about the logistics of their meetings in Mexico. These discussions revealed additional complexities in his story, including claims about ongoing surveillance by cartel members and restrictions on his movements that would affect their ability to visit certain locations or speak with specific individuals. While these claims were consistent with someone who had genuinely been victimized by organized crime, they also provided convenient explanations for any limitations on the investigation's scope or depth. McKay Coppin's flight descended through the smog-laden air above Mexico City in late July, carrying him into what he hoped would be the decisive phase of his investigation. The sprawling metropolis stretched endlessly in all directions below, a vast urban landscape where 22 million people lived, worked, and navigated the complex realities of modern Mexico. Somewhere in this enormous city, Coppins hoped to find the truth about Mauricio Morales and his extraordinary claims. The journalist's fixer met him at Benito Juarez International Airport, a middle-aged woman with the weathered face and alert eyes of someone who had spent years working in high-risk environments. She spoke in careful, measured tones as they drove through the chaotic traffic of the Mexican capital, explaining the security protocols they would follow and the challenges they were likely to encounter in the days ahead. The first scheduled meeting with Mao was set for that evening at a restaurant in the upscale Polanco district, an area known for its relative safety and strong security presence. Coppins arrived early, using the time to observe the neighborhood and get a sense of the environment where he would be conducting much of his investigation. The area seemed far removed from the dangerous criminal underworld that Mao had described, raising questions about how someone could move freely between such different worlds. When Mao arrived, his demeanor was noticeably different from their previous conversations. He seemed more nervous, more watchful, constantly scanning the restaurant and the street outside. This hypervigilant behavior was consistent with someone who genuinely feared for their safety, but it also made conducting a detailed interview more challenging. Every few minutes, Mao would pause mid-sentence to study other patrons or ask if Coppins had noticed anyone following them to the restaurant. During their conversation, Mao provided additional details about his alleged captivity that hadn't emerged in their previous discussions. He described specific individuals he claimed to have encountered, including other athletes, cartel members, and various support personnel who maintained the facility where the tournaments were allegedly held. These new details were vivid and specific, painting a picture of a large-scale operation involving dozens of people and significant infrastructure. However, some of these new details contradicted information that Mao had provided in earlier conversations. When pressed about these inconsistencies, he became defensive and claimed that the stress of returning to Mexico was affecting his memory. He suggested that being in the city where his alleged trauma had occurred was causing suppressed memories to resurface, explaining the emergence of new details and the modification of others. Mao's explanation for these inconsistencies was plausible from a psychological standpoint. Trauma survivors often experience fragmented memories that can change over time, particularly when they return to environments associated with their traumatic experiences. However, the pattern and nature of the inconsistencies were beginning to suggest other possible explanations that the journalist would need to explore carefully. The following day, Coppins and his fixer visited the neighborhood where Mao claimed his kidnapping had taken place. This area of Mexico City was markedly different from the upscale restaurant where they had met the previous evening. The streets were narrower, the buildings more weathered, and the atmosphere noticeably more tense. Local residents watched strangers with obvious suspicion, and the fixer advised maintaining a low profile and limiting their time in the area. Mao had provided detailed descriptions of the specific location where he claimed to have been abducted, including landmark buildings, street configurations, and distinctive features that should have made the site easy to identify. However, when Coppins and his fixer attempted to locate these landmarks, they found significant discrepancies between Mao's descriptions and the actual geography of the neighborhood. Some of the buildings that Mao had described simply didn't exist in the locations he had specified. Others were present but had different characteristics than he had claimed. Most puzzling was his description of a particular intersection that supposedly had distinctive architectural features. When they located what appeared to be the intersection in question, the buildings were entirely different from what he had described. These geographical inconsistencies were troubling, but they weren't necessarily conclusive evidence of fabrication. Mexico City is a rapidly changing urban environment where buildings are frequently demolished, renovated, or repurposed. It was possible that the area had changed significantly since Mao's alleged kidnapping, though the scale of the discrepancies seemed to suggest something more fundamental than normal urban development. The fixer arranged for Coppens to speak with several local residents who had lived in the neighborhood for many years. These conversations required careful handling, as residents of areas with known cartel presence are often reluctant to discuss criminal activities with outsiders. However, through patient conversation and the fixer's established relationships, they were able to gather some useful information. None of the long-term residents recalled any unusual activity during the time period when Mao claimed to have been kidnapped from the area. While they were understandably cautious about discussing criminal activities in detail, they seemed genuinely puzzled by descriptions of the large-scale operation that would have been necessary to transport multiple athletes and maintain the kind of tournament facility that Mao had described. That evening, Coppens met with the first of Mao's family members, an uncle who had allegedly been involved in searching for him during his claimed disappearance. This conversation would prove to be one of the most revealing of the entire investigation, though not in ways that Coppens had anticipated. The uncle was clearly uncomfortable throughout their meeting, frequently glancing at Mao and seeming to choose his words carefully. When asked about the period when Mao was allegedly missing, the uncle's account contained significant gaps and inconsistencies. He claimed to have contacted authorities about Mao's disappearance, but couldn't provide specific details about which agencies he had contacted or what responses he had received. More puzzling was the uncle's description of Mao's condition when he supposedly returned from his captivity. According to Mao's story, he had endured weeks of physical and psychological trauma, including forced participation in athletic competitions under threat of death. Such experiences would typically leave visible physical and emotional effects that family members would be likely to notice and remember clearly. However, the uncle's recollections of Mao's return were vague and contradictory. He couldn't clearly describe any physical injuries or signs of mistreatment, and his account of Mao's emotional state was inconsistent with what might be expected from someone who had experienced such severe trauma. When pressed for more specific details, the uncle became increasingly uncomfortable and eventually suggested that they end their conversation. After the uncle left, Mao claimed that his family member had been intimidated into providing incomplete information. He suggested that cartel threats extended to his relatives, preventing them from speaking openly about what had happened. This explanation was consistent with his broader narrative about ongoing danger and the need for secrecy, but it also provided a convenient excuse for any contradictory information that family members might provide. The third day of McKay Coppens' investigation in Mexico City brought him face-to-face with what would become the most challenging aspect of his reporting, navigating the complex web of relationships and allegiances that surrounded Mauricio Morales. The journalist's schedule for the day included meetings with several of Mao's associates, individuals who allegedly knew details about his background, his activities in Mexico, and potentially his claimed experiences with the cartels. The first meeting was with a business associate of Mao's, someone who claimed to have worked with him on various entrepreneurial ventures in Mexico City. This individual, a well-dressed man in his 40s who insisted on meeting at an expensive restaurant in the Santa Fe district, presented himself as someone with extensive connections throughout Mexican business and political circles. During their conversation, this associate painted a picture of Mao that differed in subtle but significant ways from the version that had emerged in previous interviews. According to this source, Mao was involved in a much broader range of business activities than he had previously disclosed. These activities included import-export operations, real estate ventures, and consulting work for various Mexican companies seeking to expand internationally. Some of these business activities, the associate suggested, operated in legal gray areas that could potentially bring someone into contact with criminal organizations. Mexico's economy includes substantial informal sectors where legitimate businesses often interact with semi-legal or illegal enterprises. The associate implied, without stating directly, that Mao's business dealings might have exposed him to risks that he hadn't fully disclosed to the journalist. When pressed for more specific details about these business activities, the associate became evasive. He claimed that providing too much information could compromise ongoing business relationships and potentially put various people at risk. However, he did suggest that some of Mao's ventures had involved significant sums of money and connections to individuals with questionable backgrounds. The associate's account raised troubling questions about Mao's credibility and the completeness of his disclosure to Coppens. If Mao had been involved in business activities that could have legitimately brought him into contact with criminal organizations, this might provide alternative explanations for any genuine dangers he faced. It could also suggest motivations for fabricating or embellishing his story that went beyond simple attention-seeking. After the meeting with the business associate, Coppens and his fixer traveled to a different part of Mexico City to visit what Mao had described as one of the locations where he was allegedly held during his captivity. This journey took them through several neighborhoods with varying levels of security and criminal activity, providing the journalist with a broader understanding of the city's complex criminal geography. The location that Mao had identified was a warehouse complex in an industrial area on the outskirts of the city. According to his account, this facility had been modified by the cartels to include various athletic training areas and competition spaces. He described it as a sophisticated operation with professional-grade equipment, security systems, and accommodations for both competitors and spectators. When they arrived at the actual location, however, Coppens found a complex of aging industrial buildings that showed no signs of the recent modifications or sophisticated security systems that Mao had described. The fixer made discreet inquiries with security guards and nearby business owners, trying to determine if there had been any unusual activity at the location during the relevant time period. The responses they received were uniformly negative. None of the local sources could recall any significant changes to the warehouse complex, any unusual traffic patterns, or any activity that might be consistent with the large-scale operation that Mao had described. The security guard who had worked at the complex for several years was particularly adamant that nothing resembling an athletic facility had ever been constructed on the property. These findings were difficult to reconcile with Mao's detailed descriptions of the facility. Either his memory of the location was completely incorrect, the facility had been constructed and dismantled with remarkable speed and efficiency, or significant aspects of his story were fabricated. None of these explanations was entirely satisfactory, but the weight of evidence was beginning to point towards serious problems with his account. That afternoon brought another crucial meeting, this time with one of Mao's childhood friends who allegedly knew him well and could provide background information about his character and history. This friend, a woman in her 30s who worked in Mexico City's financial district, had agreed to meet with Coppens despite expressing concerns about the potential consequences of discussing Mao's situation. The childhood friend's account of Mao's personality and background was generally consistent with what he had told Coppens, but it included some troubling details that hadn't emerged in previous conversations. She described Mao as someone who had always been prone to embellishing stories and seeking attention through dramatic narratives. This wasn't necessarily unusual behavior, but it raised questions about his reliability as a source for extraordinary claims. More concerning was her description of Mao's financial situation in recent years. According to the friend, Mao had experienced significant business failures and accumulating debts that had put considerable pressure on his lifestyle and social standing. She suggested that he might be motivated to seek ways to monetize his Olympic background and personal story, potentially through book deals, movie rights, or other commercial arrangements. When Coppens confronted Mao about these allegations later that evening, his response was defensive and contradictory. He initially denied having discussed commercial opportunities related to his story, then admitted to exploring options, but claimed that any commercial interest was secondary to his desire to expose the truth about cartel activities. His explanations for the inconsistencies were becoming increasingly convoluted and difficult to verify. The investigation was also complicated by security concerns that appeared to be more complex than initially understood. The fixer had noticed individuals who seemed to be conducting surveillance of their activities, though it wasn't clear whether these individuals were connected to law enforcement, criminal organizations, or other interests. The possibility that multiple parties might be monitoring the investigation added an additional layer of uncertainty to an already complicated situation. During a late-night conversation with his fixer, Coppens began to piece together a different understanding of the investigation's challenges. The fixer suggested that the journalist might be dealing not just with potential fabrication on Mao's part, but with a more complex situation involving multiple layers of deception and competing interests. The truth about Mao's experiences might be buried beneath commercial motivations, psychological factors, and possibly legitimate but undisclosed criminal connections. The fixer also raised concerns about the safety implications of continuing the investigation. If Mao was connected to criminal activities through his business dealings, then investigating his story might inadvertently expose the journalist to dangers that went beyond the risks associated with reporting on cartels. The possibility that they might be investigating not just a fabricated story, but a cover story designed to conceal actual criminal connections, required careful consideration of how to proceed. As the investigation entered its second week in Mexico City, Coppens found himself grappling with fundamental questions about the nature of truth in investigative journalism. The story that had originally seemed to be either true or false was revealing itself to be something far more complex, a mixture of possible truths, definite fabrications, genuine dangers, and manufactured drama that defied simple categorization. The fourth day of the Mexico City investigation brought McKay Coppens to what he would later describe as the turning point of the entire case. What began as routine fact-checking had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing, an investigation that was revealing not just the falsity of Mauricio Morales' claims, but the existence of an elaborate web of deception that extended far beyond a simple fabricated kidnapping story. The day began with a scheduled visit to what Mao had described as a cartel-controlled market where he claimed to have been taken during his captivity. This location, according to his account, was where cartel members would sometimes bring their captives to demonstrate their control over legitimate businesses and show the extent of their influence in Mexico City's economy. Given the potentially dangerous nature of visiting an area under cartel control, Coppens and his fixer had arranged for additional security support, a professional security guard with experience in high-risk journalism assignments. The three-person team approached the market cautiously, following protocols designed to minimize their visibility while allowing them to observe and gather information about the location's characteristics and activities. The market itself was a bustling commercial area where hundreds of vendors sold everything from fresh produce to electronics to clothing imported from China and other Asian countries. On the surface, it appeared to be a typical Mexican mercado, with the normal mix of legitimate businesses, informal vendors, and the organized chaos that characterizes such commercial spaces throughout Latin America. However, their security guard quickly identified signs that suggested criminal organization involvement in the market's operations. Certain vendor stalls appeared to be protected by individuals who weren't typical market security personnel, some business transactions involved unusually large amounts of cash, and there were subtle territorial markers that indicated the area was indeed under the control of organized crime groups. What they didn't find, however, was any evidence to support Mao's specific claims about being brought to this location during his alleged captivity. When the team made discreet inquiries about unusual activity during the relevant time period, they couldn't identify anyone who recalled the kind of incidents that Mao had described. More importantly, several vendors who had worked in the market for years seemed genuinely puzzled by descriptions of the specific events that Mao claimed to have witnessed. The investigation took a dramatic turn when one of these vendors, after extensive conversation with the fixer, revealed information that cast Mao's entire story in a radically different light. This vendor, a middle-aged woman who had operated a food stall in the market for over a decade, claimed to know Mauricio Morales personally, but her account of their relationship differed fundamentally from what he had told Coppens. According to the vendor, Mao was a regular customer at the market who came there frequently for business meetings and social interactions. She described him not as a kidnapping victim who had been brought there against his will, but as someone who appeared comfortable and familiar with the environment. More troubling, she suggested that his business activities in the area might have involved connections to some of the criminal organizations that exercised influence over market operations. This revelation forced Coppens to reconsider everything he thought he understood about Mao's story and motivations. If the vendor's account was accurate, then Mao's claimed kidnapping and captivity might be elaborate fabrications designed to conceal actual criminal connections or business relationships that he couldn't acknowledge publicly. The implications of this possibility extended far beyond simple journalistic deception into potential legal and safety issues for everyone involved in the investigation. The team left the market with more questions than answers, but the conversation with the vendor had provided crucial insights that would guide the remainder of their investigation. Coppens realized that he needed to fundamentally reconsider his approach, shifting from trying to verify claims about cartel kidnapping to investigating the true nature of Mao's relationships and activities in Mexico City. That afternoon's scheduled meeting with another of Mao's associates took on new significance in light of the morning's discoveries. This associate, who had previously been presented as a friend who could corroborate general aspects of Mao's background, instead provided information that further undermined his credibility and revealed additional layers of deception that the journalist hadn't previously suspected. The associate revealed that Mao had been involved in what appeared to be fraudulent business schemes that targeted foreign investors and international organizations. These schemes allegedly involved misrepresenting his Olympic credentials, fabricating business partnerships with legitimate Mexican companies, and creating false documentation to support various commercial proposals. According to this source, Mao's activities had brought him to the attention of both Mexican authorities and international organizations that had been victims of his alleged fraud schemes. The associate suggested that Mao's current circumstances might be related not to cartel victimization, but to legal trouble stemming from his business activities and the need to avoid accountability for his actions. Even more disturbing was the associate's revelation that Mao's fabrications had allegedly involved multiple international organizations, including humanitarian NGOs and cultural institutions. The associate mentioned connections to several high-profile individuals and organizations, including references to Japanese cultural figures and international peace activists who had apparently been targeted by Mao's schemes. These allegations, if accurate, suggested that the journalist had stumbled into a much larger and more complex criminal enterprise than he had originally anticipated. What had begun as an investigation into alleged cartel kidnapping was revealing itself to be a case involving international fraud, identity theft, and the systematic manipulation of legitimate organizations and individuals for financial gain. The associate provided names and details that would allow Coppens to begin investigating these broader allegations, but he also warned about the potential dangers involved. According to this source, Mao's activities had created enemies in multiple countries and among various criminal and legitimate organizations. The associate suggested that some of the surveillance that the investigation team had noticed might be related to these other conflicts rather than cartel interests. That evening, when Coppens attempted to confront Mao with these new allegations, the subject's responses revealed the full extent of the deception that had been uncovered. Rather than providing explanations or defending against the accusations, Mao became evasive and ultimately acknowledged that significant aspects of his original story had been fabricated or embellished. However, even these admissions were themselves suspect, as Mao continued to insist that some core elements of his story were true while simultaneously changing his account of which elements were accurate and which were fabricated. His explanations for the deceptions were themselves contradictory and seemed designed more to limit damage than to provide genuine insight into his motivations and activities. The conversation revealed that Mao's relationship with truth was far more complex and disturbing than simple fabrication of a kidnapping story. He appeared to have constructed multiple, overlapping false narratives about different aspects of his life and activities, each designed to serve different purposes and audiences. The cartel kidnapping story was apparently just one element of a much larger deception enterprise that had been operating for years. As the Mexico City phase of the investigation drew to a close, Coppens realized that he had uncovered something far more significant than a simple case of journalistic hoax. The evidence suggested the existence of a sophisticated fraud operation that had successfully deceived multiple victims over an extended period, using a combination of fabricated personal narratives, false credentials, and exploitation of legitimate organizations' desire to support worthy causes. The journalist faced a critical decision about how to proceed with his reporting. The story he had originally set out to investigate had proven to be largely or entirely fabricated, but the investigation had revealed what appeared to be serious criminal activity that extended far beyond the original claims. The ethical and legal implications of reporting on these discoveries would require careful consideration and consultation with editors and legal experts back in the United States. McKay Coppens' final days in Mexico City were spent not investigating cartel kidnapping claims, but unraveling what appeared to be an international fraud scheme of remarkable scope and audacity. The evidence that had emerged during his field work suggested that Mauricio Morales' fabricated story about forced participation in intercartel sporting tournaments was merely the tip of an iceberg involving systematic deception of individuals and organizations across multiple countries and continents. The journalist's investigation had revealed connections that initially seemed implausible but became increasingly credible as more evidence emerged. According to multiple sources, Mao had allegedly targeted humanitarian organizations, cultural institutions, and wealthy individuals with various schemes that exploited their desire to support worthy causes or invest in socially conscious business ventures. One of the most shocking revelations involved alleged connections to internationally recognized figures in the art and peace activism communities. Sources claimed that Mao had successfully deceived representatives of major cultural institutions by presenting himself as a reformed former cartel victim who wanted to use his experiences to promote peace and reconciliation in Mexico. These fabricated credentials had apparently opened doors to funding opportunities and high-profile endorsements that legitimate applicants might never have accessed. The methodology of these alleged frauds was sophisticated and revealed deep understanding of how international organizations evaluate potential partners and funding recipients. Mao had apparently created elaborate documentation including false testimonials, fabricated business records, and counterfeit credentials from legitimate Mexican institutions. The quality and comprehensiveness of these deceptions suggested either exceptional individual skill or the involvement of organized criminal networks with experience in document forgery and identity fraud. Among the most disturbing aspects of the scheme was its alleged exploitation of legitimate trauma and human rights concerns. By positioning himself as a victim of cartel violence, Mao could appeal to organizations and individuals who were genuinely committed to addressing human rights abuses and supporting survivors of criminal violence. This exploitation of good intentions represented a particularly cynical form of fraud that damaged not only immediate victims but also the broader cause of supporting legitimate survivors. Coppin's research into these broader allegations led him to discover what appeared to be a pattern of similar schemes operating throughout Latin America and potentially in other regions. The journalist found evidence suggesting that organized fraud networks had developed sophisticated techniques for identifying and targeting international organizations, wealthy individuals, and government agencies that might be susceptible to appeals based on fabricated human rights violations and social justice narratives. The international dimensions of these activities raised complex jurisdictional and investigative challenges. Crimes that crossed multiple national boundaries and involved victims in different countries required coordination between law enforcement agencies that didn't always communicate effectively or share common legal frameworks. This complexity created opportunities for sophisticated fraudsters to operate with relative impunity by moving their activities between jurisdictions and exploiting gaps in international cooperation. One particular aspect of the scheme that emerged during the Mexico City investigation involved alleged connections to Japanese cultural organizations and peace advocacy groups. Sources claimed that Mao had successfully presented himself to these organizations as a Mexican athlete-turned-peace activist who could help build cultural bridges between Japan and Mexico. These connections had apparently resulted in financial support, public endorsements, and introductions to additional potential targets. The Japanese connections were particularly significant because they suggested that the fraud scheme had achieved a level of international recognition and credibility that went far beyond simple financial scams. By gaining endorsements from respected cultural and peace organizations, Mao had apparently created a network of unwitting accomplices who provided legitimacy for his subsequent approaches to other potential victims. Even more troubling was the discovery that some of the individuals and organizations that had been deceived were themselves highly sophisticated and experienced in evaluating international partnerships and funding proposals. The success of Mao's alleged scheme suggested that the deceptions were extraordinarily well crafted and that the fraudulent documentation was of professional quality that could withstand initial scrutiny from experienced evaluators. The story's elements were carefully calibrated to discourage deep investigation while maximizing emotional impact. Claims about ongoing cartel threats provided explanations for secrecy and evasiveness, while the Olympic background added credibility and interest that might not have been present with a purely fictional victim identity. The combination created a narrative that was designed to be believed rather than investigated. During his final meetings in Mexico City, Coppins interviewed several additional sources who provided disturbing details about the scope and impact of Mao's alleged activities. These sources described a pattern of behavior that extended over several years and had affected dozens of individuals and organizations. The financial losses alone appeared to be substantial, but the broader damage to trust and credibility within international development and humanitarian communities might be even more significant. Perhaps most troubling was the revelation that Mao's activities might have compromised legitimate efforts to address actual human rights violations and support genuine victims of criminal violence. By creating false narratives about cartel victimization, he had potentially made it more difficult for real survivors to be believed and supported by international organizations that had been burned by his deceptions. The investigation also uncovered evidence suggesting that Mao might not be operating alone. Several sources indicated that his schemes showed signs of coordination with other individuals who possessed specialized skills in document forgery, institutional research, and international communication. The possibility that they were dealing with an organized fraud network rather than an individual operator had significant implications for both the investigation and potential law enforcement responses. As Coppens prepared to leave Mexico City, he faced the challenge of determining how to report on discoveries that extended far beyond his original assignment. The story he had set out to investigate, alleged cartel kidnapping and forced participation in sporting tournaments, had proven to be largely or entirely fabricated. However, the investigation had revealed what appeared to be serious criminal activity with international dimensions and multiple victims. The ethical considerations involved in reporting these discoveries were complex. Publishing details about the fraud schemes could potentially help other victims come forward and assist law enforcement investigations. However, it could also compromise ongoing investigations, alert other members of potential criminal networks, and raise legal issues related to reporting on alleged criminal activity that hadn't been formally prosecuted. Additionally, some of the victims of the alleged fraud schemes were themselves high-profile individuals and organizations who might face embarrassment or reputational damage if their involvement became public. Balancing the public interest in exposing criminal activity against the potential harm to victims who had already been deceived required careful consideration of journalistic ethics and responsibility. McKay Coppens' return to the United States marked the beginning of what would prove to be the most challenging phase of his investigation, synthesizing the complex and often contradictory evidence he had gathered in Mexico City and determining how to present his findings in a way that served both journalistic integrity and the public interest. The story that had begun as verification of extraordinary claims about cartel violence had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. The journalist's first task was organizing and corroborating the extensive evidence he had collected during his field work. This evidence included witness statements, photographic documentation, business records, and various forms of circumstantial evidence that painted a picture of systematic deception extending across multiple years and continents. However, much of this evidence was testimonial rather than documentary, creating challenges for verification and potential legal exposure for both the journalist and his publication. Coppens spent several weeks conducting additional interviews with sources who could potentially corroborate the allegations that had emerged during his Mexico investigation. This process revealed that the scope of Mauricio Morales' alleged activities was even broader than he had initially understood. The journalist discovered connections to fraud schemes in several other Latin American countries, as well as evidence suggesting similar activities in Europe and Asia. One of the most significant developments came when Coppens was contacted by representatives of some of the international organizations that had allegedly been targeted by Mao's schemes. These organizations, which included respected humanitarian NGOs and cultural institutions, confirmed that they had been approached by someone matching Mao's description and had indeed provided various forms of support based on his fabricated credentials and story. The organization's representatives expressed both anger at having been deceived and concern about the broader implications of the fraud for their ongoing work. Several indicated that they were reviewing their procedures for evaluating potential partners and funding recipients to prevent similar deceptions in the future. Some were also considering legal action against Mao and any accomplices who might be identified through ongoing investigations. Perhaps most troubling was the confirmation that Mao's alleged activities had indeed involved high-profile cultural figures, including connections to institutions associated with prominent Japanese peace activists and artists. The manipulation of these connections had apparently provided credibility for subsequent approaches to other potential victims, creating a snowball effect that amplified the impact of the original deceptions. Coppens also discovered that law enforcement agencies in multiple countries had opened investigations related to Mao's activities, though the complex international nature of the alleged crimes made coordination challenging. The journalist found himself in the unusual position of potentially possessing information that could assist these investigations while also needing to protect his sources and maintain his journalistic independence. The question of how to handle Mauricio Morales himself became increasingly complex as the scope of the allegations became clear. While Mao had initially cooperated with the investigation, his behavior became increasingly erratic as evidence of the broader fraud schemes emerged. He alternated between acknowledging certain deceptions and insisting that core elements of his story remained true, making it difficult to determine which aspects of his statements could be trusted. During their final series of interviews, conducted via encrypted communication channels due to security concerns, Mao provided what he claimed was a complete confession about his activities. However, even this confession was contradictory and self-serving, acknowledging some criminal activities while deflecting responsibility and claiming to have been manipulated or coerced by other individuals whose identities he refused to reveal. The confession revealed disturbing details about the methodology behind the fraud schemes, including sophisticated techniques for researching potential targets, creating convincing false documentation, and maintaining multiple false identities across different countries and organizations. Mao described a network of accomplices with specialized skills in document forgery, social engineering, and international communication, though his descriptions of these individuals were often vague or contradictory. However, even Mao's confession raised questions about his credibility and motivations. Some elements of his account seemed designed to minimize his culpability by portraying him as a victim of circumstances or manipulation by others. His descriptions of his accomplices and their activities often seemed convenient deflections of responsibility rather than genuine attempts to provide accurate information about criminal activities. The investigation also revealed the personal toll that extensive deception had taken on Mao himself. Despite his apparent success in deceiving multiple sophisticated organizations and individuals, he showed signs of psychological distress that suggested the weight of maintaining elaborate false identities over extended periods had created significant personal costs. This didn't excuse his alleged criminal activities, but it provided insight into the human dynamics that might drive such behavior. As Coppens worked to finalize his reporting, he grappled with fundamental questions about the nature of truth and deception in an era when information can be easily manipulated and verified sources are increasingly difficult to identify. The case highlighted the vulnerability of well-intentioned organizations and individuals to sophisticated fraud schemes that exploited their desire to support worthy causes and believe compelling personal narratives. The journalist also had to consider the broader implications of his findings for investigative journalism itself. The case demonstrated how initial skepticism about extraordinary claims could lead to discoveries of more conventional but equally significant criminal activity. It also showed how investigative work could uncover networks of deception that extended far beyond the original scope of inquiry. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation revealed the need for better coordination between journalism, law enforcement, and victim organizations in addressing complex international fraud schemes. The case suggested that such schemes were becoming increasingly sophisticated and that traditional approaches to investigation and prosecution might be inadequate to address their scope and complexity. The final challenge was determining how to present these findings to the public in a way that served justice for victims while maintaining journalistic integrity and protecting ongoing law enforcement investigations. The story that emerged from Coppens' investigation was far different from the one he had originally set out to verify, but it was also far more significant in its implications for understanding modern forms of international crime and deception. As the journalist prepared to publish his findings, he reflected on the complex journey that had taken him from initial skepticism about cartel kidnapping claims to discovery of what appeared to be a sophisticated international fraud network. The investigation had demonstrated both the importance of rigorous fact-checking and the unexpected directions that serious investigative work could take when pursued with appropriate persistence and resources. As McKay Coppens delved deeper into the documentation and evidence he had gathered, a disturbing pattern began to emerge that suggested Mauricio Morales' activities were part of a much larger and more sophisticated criminal enterprise than initially suspected. The journalist's analysis of communication records, financial documents, and witness statements revealed what appeared to be a coordinated network of individuals operating across multiple continents with shared resources and expertise. The network's operations showed remarkable sophistication in targeting specific types of organizations and individuals who might be susceptible to appeals based on fabricated human rights violations and compelling personal narratives. The selection criteria appeared to include organizations with substantial funding capacity, limited verification procedures, and institutional cultures that prioritized supporting worthy causes over extensive due diligence. Coppens discovered evidence suggesting that the network maintained detailed profiles of potential targets, including information about their funding priorities, decision-making processes, and key personnel who might be influenced by particular types of appeals. This level of research and preparation indicated resources and expertise that went far beyond what individual fraudsters typically possessed, suggesting either extensive criminal organization or support from legitimate research institutions that had been compromised or deceived. One particularly troubling aspect of the network's operations was its apparent ability to create and maintain false identities that could withstand initial scrutiny from sophisticated organizations. The documentation supporting these false identities included not just forged documents, but elaborate backstories supported by fake social media profiles, fabricated academic records, and counterfeit endorsements from legitimate institutions. The quality and comprehensiveness of these false identities suggested access to professional-grade document forgery services, advanced understanding of institutional verification processes, and possibly corruption or infiltration of legitimate record-keeping organizations. The network appeared to have solved many of the technical challenges that typically limit the effectiveness of identity fraud schemes. Coppens' investigation also revealed that the network had developed sophisticated techniques for exploiting cultural and linguistic barriers that often complicated international verification efforts. By operating across multiple countries and languages, the fraudsters could exploit the practical difficulties that organizations faced in conducting thorough background checks on international partners and funding recipients. The financial aspects of the network's operations were particularly complex and suggested access to banking and money transfer services that could facilitate the movement of funds across multiple jurisdictions while obscuring their ultimate destinations. This financial infrastructure appeared to involve both legitimate financial institutions that had been deceived about the nature of their clients' activities and potentially criminal financial services that specialized in money laundering and fraud proceeds. Perhaps most concerning was evidence suggesting that the network had successfully infiltrated or developed relationships with individuals within legitimate organizations who provided intelligence about internal procedures, upcoming funding opportunities, and the personal interests and vulnerabilities of decision-makers. This insider information appeared to be crucial to the network's ability to craft convincing appeals and time their approaches for maximum effectiveness. The journalist discovered that some of the network's activities had targeted academic institutions, research organizations, and policy think tanks in addition to humanitarian and cultural organizations. These academic connections provided additional credibility for the network's operations while potentially compromising research and policy development processes that affected public understanding of important issues related to human rights and international development. Coppens found evidence suggesting that the network had been operating for several years and had successfully deceived dozens of organizations and hundreds of individuals across multiple continents. The total financial losses appeared to be in the millions of dollars, but the broader damage to institutional trust and credibility was potentially much more significant than the direct financial impact. The investigation revealed that the network's success had created a model that other criminal organizations were apparently attempting to replicate. Intelligence sources indicated that similar schemes were emerging in other regions, suggesting that the techniques developed by Mao's network were being adapted and expanded by additional criminal enterprises. One of the most disturbing discoveries was evidence that some legitimate victims of criminal violence had been impersonated or had their stories stolen and modified for use in fraud schemes. This meant that the network's activities weren't just creating false narratives, but were actively exploiting and distorting real trauma and suffering for criminal gain. The psychological and social impact on genuine victims whose stories had been hijacked was particularly troubling. The network's operations also appeared to have created significant challenges for legitimate organizations working to address human rights violations and support survivors of criminal violence. Several humanitarian organizations reported increasing difficulty in identifying and supporting genuine victims because of the suspicion and enhanced verification procedures that had become necessary in response to sophisticated fraud schemes. Coppin's research revealed that some law enforcement agencies had been investigating aspects of the network's activities for several years, but that coordination between different jurisdictions and agencies had been limited. The complex international nature of the crimes, combined with jurisdictional limitations and resource constraints, had allowed the network to operate with relative impunity despite multiple ongoing investigations. The journalist also discovered that some of the network's activities had political implications beyond simple financial fraud. By creating false narratives about human rights violations and criminal activity, the schemes had potentially influenced policy discussions and resource allocation decisions within government agencies and international organizations responsible for addressing these issues. The sophistication of the network's media manipulation techniques was particularly troubling from a journalistic perspective. The fraudsters had developed detailed understanding of how news organizations evaluated and reported on human rights stories, allowing them to craft narratives that were likely to attract media attention while being difficult to fact-check effectively within typical newsroom time and resource constraints. Evidence suggested that the network had successfully placed fabricated stories with multiple news organizations across different countries, creating a body of seemingly independent reporting that provided additional credibility for their subsequent appeals to potential victims. This media manipulation represented a particularly cynical exploitation of journalistic integrity and public trust in news reporting. As the scope of the network's activities became clear, Coppins faced the challenge of determining how to report on these discoveries without compromising ongoing law enforcement investigations or providing a roadmap that other criminal organizations might use to develop similar schemes. The story had evolved far beyond its original focus on cartel kidnapping claims to encompass issues of international fraud, institutional vulnerability, and the weaponization of human rights narratives for criminal gain. The journalist realized that his investigation had uncovered not just a criminal enterprise, but a new form of sophisticated international fraud that exploited some of society's most important institutions and values. The implications extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass fundamental questions about how legitimate organizations could protect themselves from such deception while continuing to fulfill their important social missions. As McKay Coppins worked to understand the full scope of the criminal network he had uncovered, he began the sensitive process of reaching out to the individuals and organizations that had been victimized by the elaborate fraud schemes. This phase of the investigation would prove to be both the most emotionally challenging and the most important for understanding the true impact of the crimes that had been committed. The journalist's first contact was with a prominent humanitarian organization that had provided substantial funding to what they believed were legitimate peace and reconciliation efforts in Mexico. The organization's representatives were initially reluctant to discuss their involvement, partly out of embarrassment at having been deceived and partly due to concerns about the potential impact on their reputation and ability to continue their important work. When the organization's leadership eventually agreed to speak with Coppins, their account revealed the sophisticated nature of the deception they had encountered. The approach from Mao's network had come through what appeared to be legitimate referral channels, including endorsements from respected individuals and organizations that had themselves been deceived. The documentation supporting the funding request had been comprehensive and professionally prepared, including detailed project descriptions, budget justifications, and impact assessments. The organization had conducted what they considered appropriate due diligence, including reference checks with the endorsing organizations and verification of some key facts about the proposed project. However, the fraudsters' sophisticated preparation and the network of false endorsements had successfully passed this initial scrutiny. It was only when the organization attempted to conduct site visits and evaluate project progress that inconsistencies began to emerge. The financial impact on this organization alone was substantial, involving several $100,000 in grants that had been provided based on fabricated project proposals and false reporting. However, the representatives emphasized that the financial loss was less significant than the damage to their institutional credibility and the impact on their ability to support legitimate projects in the future. The organization had been forced to implement much more extensive verification procedures for international partnerships, requiring additional staff time and resources that reduced their overall capacity to support worthy causes. They had also experienced damage to their relationships with other organizations and donors who questioned their judgment and oversight capabilities. Perhaps most troubling was the organization's revelation that their experience had made them more skeptical of all applications from individuals claiming to be survivors of violence or human rights violations. This defensive response, while understandable, potentially harmed legitimate victims who might face additional scrutiny and barriers when seeking support from organizations that had been burned by sophisticated fraud schemes. Coppins also interviewed representatives of a cultural institution that had been targeted by the network's operations. This organization had been approached by individuals claiming to represent Mexican artists and cultural figures who wanted to develop international collaborations focused on peace and reconciliation themes. The proposed projects had included exhibitions, cultural exchanges, and educational programs that aligned perfectly with the institution's mission and priorities. The cultural institution's experience highlighted another dimension of the network's sophistication, their ability to identify and exploit the specific interests and priorities of different types of organizations. The approaches to cultural institutions emphasized artistic and educational aspects, while approaches to humanitarian organizations focused on direct services and advocacy work. This customization suggested extensive research and planning capabilities. The institution had provided both financial support and institutional endorsements for what they believed were legitimate cultural projects. These endorsements had then been used by the network to approach other potential victims, creating a cascading effect where each successful deception provided credibility for subsequent approaches. The institution's reputation and relationships had been weaponized against other potential victims without their knowledge or consent. One of the most disturbing victim stories involved a wealthy individual who had been targeted for a particularly elaborate personal approach. This victim, a successful entrepreneur with a history of supporting social causes, had been contacted by someone claiming to be a reformed former cartel victim who wanted to establish a foundation to help other survivors rebuild their lives. The approach to this individual had involved months of relationship building, including personal meetings, introductions to other supposed victims, and detailed proposals for foundation activities. The fraudster had invested considerable time and effort in understanding the potential victim's personal interests, family background, and philanthropic priorities. The relationship that developed appeared to be genuine friendship, making the eventual discovery of the deception particularly traumatic. This victim had provided not only financial support but also personal endorsements and introductions to other wealthy individuals who might be interested in supporting similar causes. The betrayal of personal trust involved in this case went far beyond simple financial fraud to encompass psychological manipulation and exploitation of genuine compassion and desire to help others. The investigation also revealed that some victims had been academic researchers and journalists who had been provided with false information for studies and articles about human rights issues in Mexico and other Latin American countries. This academic fraud had potentially influenced scholarly research and public understanding of important social issues, creating distortions in the knowledge base that informed policy discussions and resource allocation decisions. Several journalists reported that they had been contacted by individuals claiming to be survivors of various forms of criminal violence who offered to share their stories for news reports and documentary projects. Some of these approaches had resulted in published articles and broadcast segments that were based on fabricated information, requiring subsequent corrections and causing professional embarrassment for the journalists involved. The network's ability to successfully deceive experienced journalists highlighted the sophistication of their techniques for media manipulation. The fraudsters understood how newsrooms operated, what types of stories were likely to attract editorial interest, and how to present information in ways that would pass initial fact-checking while being difficult to verify comprehensively within typical publishing deadlines. Coppins discovered that some of the victim organizations had begun informal coordination to share information about suspected fraud attempts and develop better procedures for identifying and preventing similar schemes. This coordination was complicated by competitive relationships between organizations and concerns about sharing sensitive information, but the severity of the problem had forced some level of cooperation despite these challenges. One victim organization had discovered that their internal communications and planning documents had somehow been accessed by the fraudsters, who used detailed knowledge of upcoming funding opportunities and decision-making processes to time their approaches perfectly. This suggested either sophisticated cyber intrusion capabilities or the presence of insider accomplices within legitimate organizations, a possibility that created additional paranoia and security concerns. The psychological impact on individual victims was particularly severe in cases where personal relationships had been established with the fraudsters. Several individuals described feeling not just financially victimized but personally betrayed by people they had come to trust and consider friends. The manipulation of genuine emotions and relationships for criminal gain had created lasting trauma that extended far beyond financial losses. Some victims reported that their experiences had fundamentally changed their approach to philanthropy and social activism. The fear of being deceived again had made them more cautious and skeptical, potentially reducing their overall charitable giving and involvement in social causes. This represented a broader social cost of the fraud schemes that extended beyond immediate victims to affect the entire ecosystem of charitable and humanitarian work. The investigation revealed that some victims had attempted to pursue legal remedies against the fraudsters but had encountered significant challenges related to international jurisdiction, evidence collection, and the sophisticated techniques used to obscure the criminals' identities and assets. Many had concluded that the costs and complexity of legal action outweighed the potential for recovery, leaving them without meaningful recourse. Law enforcement representatives who spoke with Coppens confirmed that prosecuting sophisticated international fraud schemes was extremely challenging and resource-intensive. The criminals' use of multiple jurisdictions, false identities, and sophisticated financial instruments made building prosecutable cases difficult even when substantial evidence of criminal activity existed. Many cases were never formally pursued due to these practical limitations. McKay Coppens' investigation into the criminal network's activities eventually brought him into contact with law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions that were grappling with the complex challenges of investigating and prosecuting sophisticated international fraud schemes. These conversations revealed the scope of the law enforcement response and the significant obstacles that investigators faced in addressing crimes that transcended national boundaries and exploited gaps in international cooperation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had opened investigations related to several aspects of the network's activities, focusing primarily on crimes committed within United States jurisdiction and against American victims. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, who served as the lead investigator on the case, explained that the international nature of the crimes created substantial complications for traditional investigative approaches. According to Agent Rodriguez, the network's sophisticated use of technology, multiple identities, and complex financial structures had required the FBI to develop new investigative techniques and coordinate with agencies that typically focused on different types of criminal activity. The case involved elements of identity theft, wire fraud, money laundering, and potentially organized crime, requiring expertise from multiple specialized units within the Bureau. The agent revealed that the investigation had been ongoing for over 2 years before Coppens' journalistic inquiry brought additional evidence and victim testimony to their attention. The FBI had initially become involved through reports from financial institutions that had noticed suspicious transaction patterns involving accounts linked to fabricated identities and fraudulent documentation. However, the investigation had been complicated by the network's sophisticated operational security and the international scope of their activities. Traditional investigative techniques like surveillance and financial record analysis were limited in effectiveness when dealing with criminals who operated across multiple countries and maintained extensive networks of false identities. Agent Rodriguez explained that the network appeared to have studied law enforcement investigative techniques and designed their operations to exploit weaknesses in international cooperation and jurisdiction limitations. They carefully structured their activities to ensure that evidence was distributed across multiple countries, making comprehensive investigation extremely difficult for any single law enforcement agency. The FBI's investigation had identified what appeared to be at least 12 individuals involved in various aspects of the network's operations, though determining their true identities and current locations remained challenging. Some appeared to be based in Mexico, others in various South American countries, and at least 2 were believed to be operating from locations in Europe. Interpol had issued red notices for several individuals associated with the network, but these had not yet resulted in arrests due to the criminals' sophisticated identity protection measures and their apparent ability to move freely between countries with limited law enforcement cooperation. The international nature of the crimes had created a complex web of jurisdictional issues that slowed investigation and prosecution efforts. The Mexican Federal Police had also opened investigations related to the network's activities, focusing on crimes committed within Mexican jurisdiction and the use of Mexican institutions and locations in the fraud schemes. Commander Luis Hernandez of the Federal Police's Financial Crimes Unit explained that Mexican law enforcement was dealing with the additional challenge of distinguishing between the network's activities and the legitimate criminal enterprises of established cartels. According to Commander Hernandez, the network's use of cartel-related narratives in their fraud schemes had created confusion within law enforcement agencies about whether they were dealing with traditional organized crime or a new form of sophisticated fraud. The investigation had required extensive coordination with anti-cartel units to ensure that resources were appropriately allocated and that the investigation didn't interfere with ongoing operations against actual criminal organizations. The Mexican investigation had revealed that some members of the network had indeed developed relationships with individuals connected to organized crime, though these appeared to be business relationships rather than direct organizational affiliations. This discovery had complicated the investigation by introducing legitimate security concerns about potential violence against investigators and witnesses. European law enforcement agencies had also become involved in investigating the network's activities, particularly focusing on the targeting of European cultural and humanitarian organizations. Europol had established a task force to coordinate investigation efforts across multiple European Union countries where victims had been identified. Inspector Hans Müller of the German Federal Criminal Police, who served as the European coordinator for the investigation, explained that the network's activities in Europe had focused primarily on organizations with substantial funding capacity and limited experience with international fraud schemes. The criminals had shown sophisticated understanding of European regulatory and cultural environments, suggesting either extensive research capabilities or the involvement of individuals with legitimate European backgrounds. The European investigation had uncovered evidence of the network's use of legitimate European institutions and individuals as unwitting accomplices in their schemes. Several respected organizations had provided endorsements and references based on fabricated information, which were then used to support approaches to other potential victims. This cascade effect had amplified the impact of the original deceptions. Inspector Müller revealed that European authorities had identified connections between the network and other criminal organizations involved in document forgery and identity theft. These connections suggested that the fraud network was part of a broader criminal ecosystem that provided specialized services to various types of international criminals. The investigation had also revealed evidence of the network's use of legitimate academic and research institutions to provide credibility for their operations. Several universities and think tanks had unknowingly provided platforms and endorsements for individuals connected to the network, who had presented themselves as legitimate researchers and advocates working on human rights and social justice issues. Asian law enforcement agencies, particularly in Japan and South Korea, had become involved after discovering that citizens and organizations in their countries had been targeted by the network's operations. The targeting of Asian victims appeared to involve sophisticated understanding of cultural values and philanthropic traditions that made certain approaches particularly effective. The Japanese National Police Agency had identified at least 6 organizations and 12 individuals who had been victimized by network members claiming to be involved in peace and reconciliation work in Latin America. The approaches to Japanese victims had emphasized themes of international understanding and cultural exchange that resonated strongly with potential donors and institutional partners. Detective Inspector Hiroshi Tanaka of the Japanese National Police explained that the network's success in targeting Japanese victims had been facilitated by their apparent knowledge of Japanese business culture and decision-making processes. The criminals had invested considerable effort in understanding how Japanese organizations evaluated potential international partnerships and had crafted their approaches accordingly. The multinational law enforcement effort had been coordinated through existing international cooperation mechanisms, but these had proven inadequate for addressing the sophisticated and rapidly evolving nature of the network's operations. Traditional mutual legal assistance treaties and information sharing agreements were designed for more conventional crimes and didn't provide the speed and flexibility needed for investigating modern international fraud schemes. Law enforcement representatives from multiple countries had begun developing new protocols for investigating complex international fraud cases, including enhanced information sharing procedures and coordinated action plans that could respond more quickly to emerging criminal activities. However, these efforts were still in early stages and hadn't yet been tested against sophisticated criminal networks. The investigation had also revealed significant challenges in asset recovery and victim compensation. The network's sophisticated financial structures and use of cryptocurrency and other alternative financial instruments had made it extremely difficult to trace and recover stolen funds. Most victims faced the prospect of complete financial loss with limited hope of recovery through legal processes. Agent Rodriguez emphasized that the case had highlighted fundamental weaknesses in the international systems designed to prevent and respond to sophisticated fraud schemes. The network's success had demonstrated that existing laws, regulations, and enforcement mechanisms were inadequate for addressing criminal organizations that combine traditional fraud techniques with modern technology and sophisticated understanding of institutional vulnerabilities. The journalists' analysis of all available evidence had revealed a criminal enterprise of remarkable sophistication that had successfully operated across multiple continents for several years while deceiving dozens of respected organizations and hundreds of individuals. The network's activities had demonstrated vulnerabilities in international humanitarian, cultural, and academic institutions that had broader implications for how such organizations approached partnerships and funding decisions. Mauricio Morales himself remained an enigma whose true motivations and role within the broader criminal enterprise were difficult to determine with certainty. His eventual partial confession had provided some insights into the network's operations, but his continued inconsistencies and apparent self-serving modifications of his story made him an unreliable source for understanding the full scope of the criminal activities involved. What had become clear was that Mao's fabricated story about cartel kidnapping and forced participation in sporting tournaments was just one element of a much larger deception that had been crafted specifically to appeal to entertainment industry professionals while being difficult to verify independently. The story's elements had been carefully designed to maximize emotional impact while providing explanations for secrecy and limited verification opportunities. The broader criminal network's operations had revealed sophisticated understanding of institutional psychology, cultural values, and the practical challenges faced by organizations working in international development and humanitarian fields. The criminals had successfully exploited the desire of well-intentioned institutions and individuals to support worthy causes, turning compassion and social commitment into vulnerabilities that could be manipulated for financial gain. Coppin's investigation had documented financial losses exceeding several $1 million across multiple victims, but the broader social costs were potentially much more significant. The damage to institutional trust and credibility could affect the ability of legitimate organizations to raise funds and develop partnerships for years to come. The increased skepticism and enhanced verification procedures that victims had been forced to implement could create barriers for genuine survivors of violence and human rights violations. The case had also revealed significant weaknesses in international law enforcement cooperation and the challenges involved in investigating and prosecuting sophisticated criminal enterprises that operated across multiple jurisdictions. Despite extensive investigation efforts by law enforcement agencies in several countries, few arrests had been made and victim compensation remained unlikely. The journalists' research had uncovered evidence that the techniques developed by this network were being studied and potentially replicated by other criminal organizations. The success of the fraud schemes had created a model that other criminals were attempting to adapt for their own use, suggesting that similar cases might emerge in the future unless institutional defenses were significantly strengthened. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the network's exploitation and distortion of real human rights issues and genuine trauma experiences. By creating false narratives about cartel violence and other serious criminal activities, the fraudsters had potentially made it more difficult for legitimate survivors to be believed and supported. They had weaponized society's commitment to addressing human rights violations for criminal gain. The investigation had also revealed the vulnerability of media organizations to sophisticated manipulation and the challenges involved in fact-checking compelling personal narratives within typical newsroom time and resource constraints. The network had demonstrated detailed understanding of journalistic practices and had crafted their deceptions accordingly, raising questions about how news organizations could better protect themselves from similar manipulation. Coppens recognized that his investigation had implications beyond the specific criminal case he had documented. The story illustrated broader challenges related to information verification in an era when technology made it increasingly easy to create convincing false documentation and maintain elaborate false identities across multiple platforms and jurisdictions. The case had demonstrated that traditional approaches to due diligence and verification might be inadequate for addressing modern forms of sophisticated deception. Organizations that worked with international partners would need to develop new techniques and protocols for confirming the authenticity of potential collaborators and the accuracy of their claims about backgrounds and experiences. As Coppens finalized his reporting, he grappled with questions about the appropriate balance between exposing criminal activity and protecting ongoing law enforcement investigations. Publishing detailed information about the network's techniques could potentially help other organizations identify and prevent similar schemes, but it could also provide a roadmap for criminals seeking to develop comparable operations. The journalist also had to consider the impact of his reporting on victims who had already suffered financial and reputational damage from their involvement with the criminal network. While exposing the fraud served the public interest, it also required victims to publicly acknowledge their involvement with criminal enterprises, potentially causing additional embarrassment and professional consequences. Ultimately, Coppens concluded that the significance of the case and its implications for institutional security and international cooperation justified comprehensive reporting despite these concerns. The story needed to be told in sufficient detail to help other potential victims recognize similar approaches and to inform policy discussions about strengthening defenses against sophisticated international fraud. The journalist's final interviews with law enforcement representatives had revealed that investigations were continuing and that additional arrests were expected as international cooperation improved and new evidence emerged. However, the complex nature of the crimes and the sophisticated techniques used by the criminals meant that full prosecution would likely take years and that many aspects of the network's operations might never be completely understood. In his conclusion, Coppens reflected on how the investigation had evolved from initial skepticism about extraordinary claims to discovery of a different but equally significant form of criminal activity. The case had demonstrated the importance of rigorous fact-checking and the unexpected directions that investigative journalism could take when pursued with appropriate resources and persistence. The story also highlighted the interconnected nature of modern criminal enterprises and the need for enhanced cooperation between journalism, law enforcement, and potential victim organizations in addressing sophisticated international crimes. The traditional boundaries between these different sectors had proven inadequate for addressing criminal networks that operated across multiple domains and jurisdictions. As Coppens prepared to submit his final article for publication, he recognized that the investigation had raised as many questions as it had answered. The case had provided insights into one sophisticated criminal network, but it had also revealed the existence of broader criminal ecosystems that remained largely unexplored and potentially much more extensive than currently understood. The journalist's work had contributed to ongoing law enforcement investigations and had provided information that might help other potential victims avoid similar deceptions. However, it had also demonstrated the limitations of individual investigative efforts in addressing criminal enterprises that operated on an international scale with sophisticated resources and techniques. The case of Mauricio Morales and his fabricated claims about intercartel sporting tournaments had ultimately revealed something far more significant and troubling than the original story would have been, even if it had been true. The investigation had uncovered a new form of international crime that exploited some of society's most important values and institutions, creating challenges that would require innovative responses from law enforcement, journalism, and civil society organizations. As we reach the end of this complex investigation, we're left with questions that extend far beyond the specific case of Mauricio Morales and his fabricated story of cartel captivity. What began as verification of extraordinary claims about underground sporting tournaments evolved into something much more significant, the discovery of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that exploited our most fundamental institutions and values. The story reminds us that in our interconnected world, the most dangerous deceptions are often not the obvious lies, but the carefully crafted narratives that exploit our desire to believe, to help, to make a difference in the world. The criminals in this case understood that compassion could be weaponized, that institutional trust could be manipulated, and that the very systems designed to address human suffering could be turned against themselves. As you rest tonight, consider the complex nature of truth in our modern world, where information can be easily manipulated but where the consequences of both action and inaction remain profoundly real. The victims of these sophisticated fraud schemes were not naive or foolish, they were organizations and individuals committed to making the world better, whose very commitment made them vulnerable to exploitation. The investigation continues, both in newsrooms and law enforcement agencies around the world. The story of this criminal network may be ending, but the broader questions it raises about trust, verification, and protecting society's most important institutions are just beginning to be explored. Sleep well, knowing that even in a world of increasing complexity and deception, the pursuit of truth continues. If you're still awake after that, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Which case should we cover next?